Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and today we're back with more. A Testament of Hope. The speeches and writings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And last time we'd read the first two chapters of his book, Stride Toward Freedom. Today we'll be reading chapter 3. So he finally moved with his wife and his family to Montgomery. Chapter 3 is the decisive arrest. On the 1st of December 1955, an attractive Negro seamstress, Miss Rosa Parks, boarded the Cleveland Avenue bus in downtown Montgomery. She was returning home after her regular day's work in the Montgomery Fair, a leading department store. Tired from long hours on her feet, Mrs. Parks sat down in the first seat behind the section reserved for whites. Not long after she took her seat, the bus operator ordered her, along with 3 other Negro passengers, to move back in order to accommodate boarding white passengers. By this time, every seat on the bus was taken. This meant that if Miss Parks followed the driver's command, she would have had to stand while a white male passenger who had just boarded the bus would sit. The other 3 Negro passengers immediately complied with the driver's request, but Miss Parks quietly refused. The result was her arrest. There was to be much speculation about why Miss Parks did not obey the driver. Many people in the white community argued that she had been planted by the NAACP in order to lay the groundwork for a test case, and at first glance that explanation seemed plausible, since she was a former secretary of the local branch of the NAACP. So persistent and persuasive was the argument that it convinced many reporters from all over the country. Later on, when I was having press conferences 3 times a week in order to accommodate the reporters and journalists who came to Montgomery from all over the world, the inevitable first question was, did the NAACP start the bus boycott? But the accusation was totally unwarranted, as the testimony of both Miss Parks and the officials of the NAACP revealed. Actually, no one could understand the action of Miss Parks unless he realizes that eventually the cup of endurance runs over and human personality cries out, I can take it no longer. Miss Parks' refusal to move back was her intrepid affirmation that she had had enough. It was an individual expression of a timeless longing for human dignity and freedom. She was not planted there by the NAACP or any other organization. She was planted there by her personal sense of dignity and self-respect. She was anchored to the seat by the accumulated indignities of days gone by and the boundless aspirations of generations yet unborn. She was a victim of both the forces of history and the forces of destiny. She had been tracked down by the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. Fortunately, Miss Parks was ideal for the role assigned to her by history. She was a charming person with a radiant personality, soft-spoken, and calm in all situations. Her character was impeccable and her dedication deep-rooted. All of these traits together made her one of the most respected people in the Negro community. Only E.D. Nixon, the signer of Miss Parks' bond, and one or two other persons were aware of the arrest when it occurred early Thursday evening. Later in the evening, the word got around to a few influential women of the community, mostly members of the Women's Political Council. After a series of telephone calls back and forth, they agreed that the Negroes should boycott the buses. They immediately suggested the idea to Nixon, and he readily concurred. In his usual courageous manner, he agreed to spearhead the idea. Early Friday morning, the 2nd of December, Nixon called me. He was so caught up in what he was about to say that he forgot to greet me with the usual hello, but plunged immediately into the story of what had happened to Mrs. Parks the night before. I listened, deeply shocked, as he described the humiliating incident. "We have taken this type of thing too long already," Nixon concluded, his voice trembling. "I feel that the time has come to boycott the buses. Only through a boycott can we make it clear that to the white folks that we will not accept this type of treatment any longer." I agreed at once that some protest was necessary and that the boycott method would be an effective one. Just before calling me, Nixon had discussed the idea with Reverend Ralph Abernathy, the young minister of Montgomery's First Baptist Church, who had become one of the central figures in the protest, and one of my closest associates. Abernathy also felt a bus boycott was our best course of action. So for 30 and 40 minutes, the three of us telephoned back and forth concerning plans and strategy. Nixon suggested that we call a meeting of all the ministers and civic leaders the same evening in order to get their thinking on the proposal, and I offered my church as the meeting place. The three of us got busy immediately. With the sanction of Reverend H. Hubbard, president of the Baptist Ministerial Alliance, Abernathy and I began calling all the Baptist ministers. Since most of the Methodist ministers were attending a denominational meeting in one of the local churches that afternoon, it was possible for Abernathy to get the announcement to all of them simultaneously. Nixon reached Mrs. A.W. West, the widow of a prominent dentist, and enlisted her assistance in getting word to the civic leaders. By early afternoon, the arrest of Mrs. Parks was becoming public knowledge. Word of it spread around the community like uncontrolled fire. Telephones began to ring in an almost rhythmic succession. By 2 o'clock, an enthusiastic group had mimeographed leaflets concerning the arrest and the proposed boycott, and by evening these had been widely circulated. As the hour for the evening meeting arrived, I approached the doors of the church with some apprehension, wondering how many of the leaders would respond to our call. Fortunately, it was one of those pleasant winter nights of unseasonable warmth, and to our relief, almost everybody who had been invited was on hand. More than 40 people from every segment of Negro life were crowded into the large church meeting room. I saw physicians, school teachers, lawyers, businessmen, postal workers, union leaders, and clergymen. Virtually every organization of the Negro community was represented. The largest number there was from the Christian ministry. Having left so many civic meetings in the past, sadly disappointed by the dearth of ministers participating, I was filled with joy when I entered the church and found so many of them there, for then I knew that something unusual was about to happen. Had E.D. Nixon been present, he would have probably have been automatically selected to preside, but he had to leave town earlier in the afternoon for his regular run on the railroad. In his absence, we concluded that Reverend Elroy Bennett, a president of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, was the logical person to take the chair. He agreed and was seated, his tall, erect figure dominating the room. The meeting opened around 7:30 with H. Hubbard leading a brief devotional period, when Bennett moved into action explaining the purpose of the gathering. With excited gestures, he reported on Miss Parks' resistance and her arrest. He presented the proposal the Negro citizens of Montgomery should boycott the buses on Monday in protest. Now is the time to move, he concluded. This is no time to talk. It is time to act. So seriously did Bennett take his no time to talk admonition that for quite a while he refused to allow anyone to make a suggestion or even raise a question, insisting that we should move on and appoint committees and implement the proposal. This approach aroused the opposition of most of those present and created a temporary uproar. For almost 45 minutes the confusion persisted. Voices rose high and many people threatened to leave if they could not raise questions and offer suggestions. It looked for a time as though the movement had come to an end before it began. But finally, in the face of blistering protest, Bennett agreed to open the meeting to discussion. Immediately, questions began to spring up from the floor. Several people wanted further clarification of Miss Parks's actions and arrest. Then came the more practical questions. How long would the protest last? How would the idea be further disseminated throughout the community? How would the people be transported to and from their jobs? As we listened to the lively discussion, we were heartened to notice that despite the lack of coherence in the meeting, not once did anyone question the validity or desirability of the boycott itself. It seemed to be the unanimous sense of the group that the boycott should take place. The ministers endorsed the plan with enthusiasm and promised to go to their congregations on Sunday morning and drive home their approval of the projected one-day protest. Their cooperation was significant since virtually all of the influential Negro ministers of the city were present. It was decided that we should hold a citywide mass meeting on Monday night, the 5th of December, to determine how long we would abstain from riding the buses. Reverend A.W. Wilson, minister of the Holt Street Baptist Church, offered his church, which was ideal as a meeting place because of its size and central location. The group agreed that additional leaflets should be distributed on Saturday, and the chairman appointed a committee, including myself, to prepare the statement. Our committee went to work while the meeting was still in progress. The final message was shorter than the one that had appeared on the first leaflets, but the substance was the same. It read as follows: "Don't ride the bus to work, to town, to school, or any place Monday, December the 5th. Another Negro woman has been arrested and put in jail because she refused to give up her bus seat. Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. If you work, take a cab, or share a ride, or walk. Come to a mass meeting Monday at 7 p.m. in the Holt Street Baptist Church for further instruction." After finishing the statement, the committee began to mimeograph it on the church machine, but since it was late, I volunteered to have the job completed early Saturday morning. The final question before the meeting concerned transportation. It was agreed that we would try to get the Negro taxi companies of the city, 18 in number, with approximately 210 taxis, to transport the people for the same price that they were currently paying on the bus. A committee was appointed to make this contact with Reverend W.J. Powell, minister of the Old Ship AME Zion Church, as chairman. With these responsibilities before us, the meeting closed. We left with our hearts caught up in a great idea. The hours were moving fast. The clock on the wall read almost midnight, but the clock in our souls revealed that it was daybreak. I was so excited that I slept very little that night. And early the next morning, I was on my way to the church to get the leaflets out. By 9 o'clock, the church secretary had finished mimeographing the 7,000 leaflets, and by 11 o'clock, an army of women and young people had taken them off to distribute by hand. Those on the committee that was to contact the taxi companies got to work early Saturday afternoon. They worked assiduously, and by evening they had reached practically all of the companies and triumphantly reported that every one of them so far had agreed to cooperate with the proposed boycott by transporting the passengers to and from work for the regular 10-cent bus fare. Meanwhile, our efforts to get the word across to the Negro community were abetted in an unexpected way. A maid who could not read very well came into possession of one of the unsigned appeals that had been distributed Friday afternoon. Apparently, not knowing what the leaflet said, she gave it to her employer. As soon as the white employer received the notice, she turned it over to the local newspaper, and the Montgomery Advertiser made the contents of the leaflet a front-page story on Saturday morning. It appears that the Advertiser printed the story in order to let the white community know what the Negroes were up to. But the whole thing turned out to be the Negroes' advantage, since it served to bring the information to hundreds who had not previously heard of the plan. By Sunday afternoon, word had spread to practically every Negro citizen of Montgomery. Only a few people who lived in remote areas had not heard of it. After a heavy day of work, I went home late Sunday afternoon and sat down to read the morning paper. There was a long article on the proposed boycott. Implicit throughout the article, I noticed was the idea that the Negroes were preparing to use the same approach to their problem as the white citizen councils used. This suggested parallel had serious implications. The white citizen councils, which had had their birth in Mississippi a few months after the Supreme Court's school decision, had come into being to preserve segregation. The councils had multiplied rapidly throughout the South, purporting to achieve their ends by the legal maneuvers of interposition and nullification. Unfortunately, however, the actions of some of these councils extended far beyond the bounds of the law. Their methods were the methods of open and covert terror, brutal intimidation, and threats of starvation to Negro men, women, and children. They took open economic reprisals against whites who dared to protest their defiance of the law, and the aim of their boycotts was not merely to impress their victims, but to destroy them if possible. Disturbed by the fact that our pending action was being equated to the boycott methods of the white citizen councils, I was forced for the first time to think seriously on the nature of the boycott. Up to this time, I had uncritically accepted this method as our best course of action. Now certain doubts began to bother me. Were we following an ethical course of action? Is the boycott method basically unchristian? Isn't it a negative approach to the solution of a problem? Is it true that we would be following the course of some of the white citizens' councils? Even if lasting practical results came from such a boycott, would immoral means justify moral ends? Each of these questions demanded honest answers. I had to recognize that the boycott method could be used to unethical and unchristian ends. I had to concede further that this was the method used so often by the white citizens' councils to deprive many Negroes, as well as white persons, of goodwill, of the basic necessities of life. But certainly, I said to myself, our pending actions could not be interpreted in this light. Our purposes were altogether different. We would use this method to give birth to justice and freedom, and also to urge men to comply with the law of the land. The white citizens' councils used it to perpetuate the reign of injustice and human servitude, and urged men to defy the law of the land. I reasoned, therefore, that the word boycott was really a misnomer for our proposed action. A boycott suggests an economic squeeze, leaving one bogged down in a negative. But we were concerned with the positive. Our concern would not be to put the bus boycott or bus company out of business, but to put justice in business. As I thought of further, I came to see that we were really doing what we were really doing was withdrawing our cooperation from an evil system, rather than merely withdrawing our economic support from the bus company. The bus company, being an external expression of the system, would naturally suffer, but the basic aim was to refuse to cooperate with evil. At this point, I began to think about Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. I remembered how, as a college student, I had been moved when I first read this work. I became convinced that what we were preparing to do in Montgomery was related to what Thoreau had expressed. We were simply saying to the white community, we can no longer lend our cooperation to an evil system. Something began to say to me, he who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. When oppressed people willingly accept their oppression, they only serve to give the oppressor a convenient justification for his acts. Often the oppressor goes along unaware of the evil involved in his oppression, so long as the oppressed accepts it. So in order to be true to one's conscience and true to God, a righteous man has no alternative but to refuse to cooperate with an evil system. This, I felt, was the nature of our action. From this moment on, I conceived of our movement as an act of massive non-cooperation. From then on, I rarely used the word boycott. Wearied, but no longer doubtful about the morality of our proposed protest, I saw that the evening had arrived unnoticed. But after several telephone calls, I prepared to retire early. But soon after I was in bed, our 2-week-old daughter, Yolanda Denise, began crying. And shortly after that, the telephone started ringing again. Clearly condemned to stay awake for some time longer, I used the time to think about other things. My wife and I discussed the possible success of the protest. Frankly, I still had doubts. Even though the word had gotten around amazingly well and the ministers had given the plan such crucial support, I still wondered whether the people had enough courage to follow through. I had seen so many admirable ventures fall through in Montgomery. Why should this many admirable, or why should this be an exception? Coretta and I finally agreed that if we could get 60% cooperation, the protest would be a success. Around midnight, a call from one of the committee members informed me that every Negro taxi company in Montgomery had agreed to support the protest on Monday morning. Whatever our prospects of success, I was deeply encouraged by the untiring work that had been done by the ministers and civic leaders. This in itself was a unique accomplishment. After the midnight call, the phone stopped ringing. Just a few minutes earlier, Yoki had stopped crying. Wearily, I said good night to Coretta, and with a strange mixture of hope and anxiety, I fell asleep. So yeah, that's the end of chapter 3. So we see in this chapter, he's dealing with the incident of Rosa Parks, her refusal to give up her seat to a white customer, for a white customer, and the subsequent arrest. And then we see the planning of the famous Montgomery bus boycott by Dr. King and the other ministers in the community. So yeah, we're getting to the point of these are some of the most infamous moments, or most famous moments if you prefer. Sometimes they're just, those two words are used interchangeably, infamous and famous. Sometimes they're not, but we'll say famous moments. But yeah, it's really it's really an interesting thing. It interests me quite a bit because we see how this forms. I mean, personally, I never knew that the Montgomery bus boycott was because of the Rosa Parks arrest. So yeah, but we're seeing things connect because King talks about them comparing the planned boycott with the White Citizens Council's boycotts. And yeah, so we have the connection of this is a direct action that is nonviolent, that is peaceful. And yeah, it'll give pushback. And I kind of enjoyed the part about the newspaper trying to print it to get a movement of angry whites, but it ended up getting a lot of support, or letting more people know about the intended boycott, so that there would be more people at the boycott itself. But yeah, what was there was a phrase in here I found really interesting. Let's see, where was that? Okay. Towards the end of this chapter, he says, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." That is huge, because it really talks about how, you know, King would often talk about the other whites who are always going around, why do you have to keep protesting, interrupting things, throwing a wrench into the works, making all this noise? You know, we don't want, why can't you just wait? And that's essentially, yeah, and you know, one of the ways it's pointed out. And again, drawing this back to the Black Lives Matter movement, when there were all the protests, you notice there were just a lot of people who were angry about them. Yes, there was violence, but there's also a newspaper cartoon from the 60s. I have it somewhere. It shows a newspaper reporter interviewing King in the cartoon, and he says, "Tomorrow we plan to have another non-violent protest," but in the background cars are wrecked and everything. So even back then, it was like, see all the violence they're doing? See all the crimes they're committing? It's why it fits so much for me with the Black Lives Matter movement. But yeah. But that'll be it for this episode. Thank you for watching. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. If someone asks you to prove, if someone says something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Forgot how I phrased it. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.